Hi, folks, and welcome to another Poultry Keepers podcast. We've got a good show for you today, and coming up in just a few seconds, we're going to make a big announcement. Stay tuned. All right. First thing I said, we've got a big announcement, and we really do. John and I were talking, and we felt like we needed to add a little more value and up our programming a little bit. And we thought the best way to do that was to bring a lady on board to work with us, because let's face it, that we have a lot of women now getting involved in this poultry fancy. And we both immediately had the same thought. There was one person we certainly wanted to bring on, and that's Mandelyn Royal. We were so fortunate that she agreed to do this because, she's a great writer. She does her own videos, Arcadian Orchard. If you want to check out her YouTube channel, has some really, really informative videos there. But Mandelyn, welcome to the Poultry Keepers podcast as another co-host. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I love talking about chickens.
That's my favorite subject.
Absolutely. Welcome. Although we've actually met once in the past, I stopped by your place on my way to South Carolina, and it was a great trip. And that's what really sealed it for me. Meeting you and getting to know your operation and your chickens and seeing firsthand what's going on your farm. Like, we need to bring this person on as a resource because it's truly inspirational to see what you're doing with this line of chickens, which are very specific and we'll get into in just a second.
But, and you're right. Mandelyn, I have learned a lot from your writings and your videos. And not only that, I have been so inspired because you are such an inspirational communicator that it really comes through in what you do. And not only that, you do a tremendous job with your birds. So, John, let's introduce Mandelyn formally. I think you got a few questions for us. I'm going to let you take it over.
You betcha. So first off, do you prefer Mandelyn or Mandy?
Either one.
Okay.
I'll answer to almost anything that starts with an M.
All right, great. I mean, I learned it as Mandelyn because I've been watching your videos now for probably a year. But I some of the basic questions, and I don't think I really got into this in watching your videos, but why did you decide to start keeping chickens?
Well, it wasn't so much of a decision as it was a natural inclination from a love of animals. And when I was a little kid, I was visiting family in Tennessee. We went down there twice a year, and I had a great uncle that was pretty well into poultry. And I asked if I could have one when I was about 7 or so. And he said, honey, if you can catch it, you can keep it. So I went out there and caught myself a little pullet, and I've just had birds ever since. But there was a whole evolution in how I kept the flock and what the flock goals were. It's changed significantly since then, because initially they were just pets. But now we're doing the whole breeding and the dual purpose thing. And we eat from our flock. And, 30 years ago, that wasn't a thought I had. But now that's what I live for chickens.
Well, that kind of leads me to my second question is what really excites you about working with poultry?
Watching the flock evolve and taking ownership in what I'm producing and why, and recognizing what they're supposed to be and going through the process. It's a little bit of art. It's a little bit of having systems in place. It brings together a lot of my favorite activities. And then also it's our food too. It covers so much ground and what they're useful for that it was pretty easy to get sucked into it.
So what are the specific goals that you have for your flock?
I can break it down into 3 different categories. So I still like to have pets, but they're not pets anymore. They're not, a puppy dog. But I do like to walk outside and see the flock out doing their thing. I like to interact with them. Sometimes you can catch me talking to a chicken. But then on the flip side, I'm wondering what value that bird has in the flock, if it's going to help with the table traits or the laying traits, or the breed standard traits and working them towards their standard that stipulates what they're supposed to be, but then also the goal of the utility. So there's 3 different functions there that I'm always looking for. And then paying attention to their health and vigor and making sure that they've got longevity and the ability to chicken well so that I can enjoy them longer, so that they can remain productive in the flock, especially if they're a favorite individual that passes itself forward well in the breeding program. So I ask a lot of them, and I'm pretty harsh on them, and that takes a little bit of quantity to do that. So we've just been growing and growing until I found a comfortable groove with a flock function.
Well, I've seen your operation. You have sufficient space to hatch out the kind of numbers that you really need to, especially working with your breed specifically. You want to tell us what's a little bit about the breed that you chose and why it's so special and some of the challenges that you have because of that?
Oh gosh, where to start? Challenges or?
Well, I haven't said it yet because I'm letting you take this. So what breed are we talking?
Well, I chose the first birds who did what I wanted the birds to do, because I was after a particular carcass type, but I needed the variety to be breedable. I wasn't going to do a hybrid and reload from a hatchery every season. I wanted to own that whole process from hatching egg all the way through processing, starting with being able to select my own breeding stock to guide them where I wanted them to be. So it ended up being
be sustainable first.
Oh yeah, sustainable. That's the word.
Okay.
Where we could keep everything in house. So it ended up being the American breast out of a lot of different varieties. I went through several very quickly. Some of them I probably didn't give them a fair chance just because of where I sourced them from. And I realized, and some of them, the other varieties, the amount of breeding work they needed to get where I wanted them to be would have been an incredible time commitment. And the American breast, that first season, showed me a lot of what I needed in that first season. So that, to me, made it an easy decision because they were most of the way to where I needed them to be.
Mandelyn, I have a quick question. I know that you don't have any problem culling your birds, but how long did it take you to realize that culling your flock is one of the most important things we can do as poultry keepers if we want to improve our birds?
Once I started seeing the undesirable traits, even in that first batch, I started with just 22 birds in the very first group from a local breeder in Kentucky. And I had her flock history. I know how she sourced them, and I knew she was more of the propagator type rather than a nitpicky breeder type. So I was able to go through and look at the ones who weren't meaty, or the ones who grew slower, or the ones who were the wrong color, because there was some yellow leakage in some of them. So I took what was undesirable and removed those, and then bred from, oh gosh, I had that down to just a single pen of 7 birds, and I hatched everything they laid that first season. And I did hatch from pullet eggs because I was in a hurry. I was hungry.
We can't blame that.
Through further research, I'm always reading and looking for additional information, but it was apparent pretty quickly, just the birds showing me, this is what you want, this is what you don't want. And the fact that the birds made it pretty obvious was really helpful, because I already went into it having an idea that it would be necessary, just from my prior mentors and what they had said, and the importance of sorting down and selecting through and using compensation mating for improvements.
So from your initial start, what percentage did you find you were able to hold back to breed forward that were good enough?
Oh, maybe 40%, because I was being generous.
Okay.
Because I knew I didn't want to make the mistake of calling myself out of a flock. And that's easy to do. If you get too picky too early, you won't have very many things to choose from later.
You do need some genetic diversity to start with. Otherwise, you don't have anything to select from.
Well, it depends on the strength of the original line too, because you're picking up where someone else left off. So based on the work they did before you came by them, it could be relatively easier. It could be an uphill battle. You have to hatch and see.
So what are your goals? What do you hope to bring to the podcast besides keeping us old men awake? And
well,
on
I'm
topic.
not actually poke you with a stick and keep you awake, but I'm hoping to just hang out with you guys and have fun talking about chickens.
All right.
I've learned a thing or two over the years, and I've probably got over 25 years of learning under my belt and a lot more to go, but I'm getting somewhere.
Well, I don't think I've reached a point in my poultry experience, so to speak, or journey, if you want to call it that, to where there's not something that I learn literally sometimes every day that helps me understand or appreciate or gives me a new idea of a technique to try. And that's a fascinating part to me because I've always been a person who enjoys learning new things. And boy, if you raise chickens long enough, you're going to learn a lot of new things over the years.
Well, Mandelyn and I, we banter back and forth, and we always say for science.
Oh, yeah.
Everything is for science. You know what? It's all going to the freezer eventually. So along the way, let's give the birds the best possible environment and life. Let's learn from them. I believe there's so much in observation and imitation.
Yes.
I spend a disproportionate amount of time just watching the birds.
You can't spend too much time watching your birds. I wish people would just, go out into their pen area, pull up a bucket or pull up a chair, glass of iced tea, and just sit and watch your birds. You will learn so much about type. You will learn about color. It's just one of the most important things that you can do is walk the flock.
One of the tasks that was actually assigned and graded in a animal sciences class that I took at college was we had to spend an hour per week sitting quietly observing our species. I was, observing chickens. And at first I was like, an hour, that's a pretty serious commitment, but I'm getting graded on it, so I got to do it. And after, 10 minutes and everybody calms down and forgets you're there and they go back about their lives, you can learn a lot by just sitting there and observing. It was a real eye-opening experience. So I do recommend that. Just take your cup of coffee or tea after they've been fed and just sit down and let them forget about you. Don't, call them up and feed them scratch and give them attention. Let them forget about you and
let them be
observe what they do.
Let them be chickens. You'll learn not only about chicken behavior in general, but also you're going to learn a lot about those individual birds. And pretty soon you'll get to the point to where your eye can just go over a flock and you can pick out the top 10% pretty easily.
Well, there's birds I recognize just by the way they run, the way they back and forth. And I'm like, oh, that's Laverne because she's wide and fluffy. And, I just recognize that. And then Mandelyn observed some pretty good behavior on the part of some other birds this morning. I'm glad somebody else saw that because most people don't believe that those birds will do that.
Well, I put them into a pen with similar aged American breasts. So there's these two. Oh, they're 3 or 4 weeks older than who I put them with. So immediately they went in there and told everyone they were the boss, but they were very polite about it. And they've been in that pen now for a little over a week. And this morning when I went out there, one of them was running with a mouse in her beak, trying to protect it from her sister. And they were very cutthroat on who was going to have possession of this little mouse they had caught. And I tried to get a picture of it, and she just kept running and hiding because I needed proof to show you, John. I'm sure you know, but proof is always good. Meanwhile, my birds were standing there watching, going, what are these girls doing? But because yours had already staked their claim on the dominance, they weren't going to jump in and argue with them over it. So they were just watching. So then as I watch them, I'm wondering, well, are these two then going to teach mine the value of going through and do that? Because the birds, they learn a lot from each other.
Absolutely.
So I'm hoping your two dinosaur birds are going to teach mine to go back to their roots a little more and hunt for their food.
But the interesting thing is those birds were raised as chicks with no elder birds around them. When I restarted my line, it was all as hatching eggs from my breeder. So that is not a learned behavior.
Instinctual.
I don't know if that's a learned behavior or not. Did one do it and they figured out, hey, we can eat this thing, and so now they all do it? But I don't know when or how that started happening with these birds, but I'm always finding half of a dead chipmunk or mouse or snake out in. Anybody who tries to come in their run is out.
Oh, so they go for big game too.
Well, around here we have the red squirrels, which they'll take out. Chipmunks they'll take out. Mice, of course, and we don't have any venomous snakes in Vermont, so we don't need to worry about that. But yes, I've seen them feasting on a garden snake. And it's not for lack of amino acids. They get an amazing diet. They're not wanting for anything. They take offense to other things trying to steal their food, I guess.
I had a buff coaching cockerel one time, and I just happened to be in the right spot at the right time. There was a rat came dashing out of the orange grove, making a beeline for the barn, and that coaching cockerel ran that rat down, killed him, and hauled him off and ate him. And as far as I know, he'd never seen anybody do that before.
And for me, that's a huge breeding factor, because we have ermine and mink down at the culvert, and they do come up, and I have lost a lot of birds to predation from them, but I have not lost any of the chanticleer to ermine or mink. I've lost them to foxes and skunks, but that's natural selection as well. What I have left, they've proved, at least to me, that they could survive.
And that's good in a flock. The survivability is more than just keeping them safe, but how they have the instincts to keep themselves safe too. Yeah. And if they keep an eye on the sky for aerial predators, if they are constantly putting their head up from being out on pasture and eating, they seem to have a watchbird, one who spends the most time looking around, and they also take turns with that too.
Yes.
And it's not always the male. Sometimes there's a head female too who will keep a stronger eye out, and she might actually be the one to start the alerting. And then the male sometimes will take over. I've got a short video somewhere of a hawk flying over, and all of my males stood right where they were, ready to go. They were all fluffed up. They started calling. All of the hens made a mad dash and went back into their barn pens. But the boys stayed out there and waited, like, come on, Hawk, let's do this.
Yeah. It's amazing what those birds will take on sometimes.
So now that you've had a few years under your belt with various breeds, what type of advice would you offer to somebody just starting out?
Try to source your birds from someone that shares your goals. So think about what your flock goals are, and then find who's producing the birds that are most likely to help you in your goals sooner rather than later. Because to have, first, second, third season success, or 5 to 10 years of breeding effort to try to get them close to what your goals are, you save a lot of time by looking for someone who has the same goals, who's already done a lot of the work for you.
So how do you find that person? That was a challenge for me.
It's a challenge for everyone, because I'm not convinced there's all that many people that actually have clear and defined goals. And I hope to see that number grow. And I hope through education and outreach that more people take their flocks more seriously, even if it's not as extensive of a breeding operation as what I have or some of the larger flocks out there. But getting away from mass-produced birds with no breeding goals it's a lot to sort through. So sometimes the advice I give to people, especially if they're worried about cost, is start with 100 chicks from wherever you can find them and then sort them down to what you're looking for. Because you can take 100 birds down to 10 and come out okay for that first season. But if you start with 10, you're not going to establish a flock very quickly that way.
No, it's difficult at best.
And if you can, I was lucky to find a breeder who was able to pedigree mate my eggs for me. And it's interesting that we struck off this relationship because most people come saying, hey, I want a dozen or 2 eggs from you. I've heard you have good birds. Whereas when I approached him, I was like, I want to buy 100 eggs from you. And this is why. And, they were practically tripping over their coveralls because they realized that, this is somebody who's kind of got their, cards in line and knows what they're doing. What do you think are those? Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Oh, no, John, I was just going to say that y'all are right. There's very few people have clearly defined goals. That's people just starting out and people who are trying to breed birds. But it's so important to have good goals, and they can't be simple little things either. They got to be long-term, big picture. Don't just say, I want to improve the egg production in my flocks. Say something like, I want to improve my egg production from 150 to 225 birds per hen. That's the kind of goals I'm talking about, stretch goals.
But that's going to take a lot of qualities in a breeder. Mandy, throw this back on you. What do you think are the qualities essential that a person needs to have to be successful at breeding chickens?
For the person, for the flock.
Well, just the general personal qualities. Like, I know I have to be insanely organized. Otherwise, I get overwhelmed with all the data.
You would go for a lot more data than I do. I'm a little weak in the note-taking department. But I use my hands and my eyes mostly, and I let the birds tell me. And health and vigor really needs to stay at the forefront. But as far as the individual breeders, you need to have the gumption to do your culling. You need to have the space to do your grow outs. Having a row of cages for sorting and figuring out the differences and the similarities from bird to bird so that you can do your breeding stock selections. Because if you take a male and put him in with a pen of 10 females and you didn't really look at them too close, you just put the group together without, and just, how do I say that?
Blender breeding?
Blender breeding. Yeah. You can't bank on achieving goals that way. So being organized is a big part of it.
And I think, and Mandy, is clear that you realize this, but for the folks listening, it's important that you choose a system and choose a method that works for you, because your individual situation is different from mine or John's or Mandy's. If it doesn't work for you, you're not going to follow through on it.
Sure.
That's true.
And there is a lot about typical expression. We can take the exact same eggs from the exact same birds and ship them, 4 different areas of the country and grow them out. And they're all going to express the same to a certain extent, but they're all going to express slightly differently based upon the husbandry practices of the poultry keeper, the environment that they're being raised in, the access to nutrition. I mean, it all leads to the bird at the end. So finding the bird that does the best for you in your environment may not be the same egg that did the best for somebody else in their environment. It's a lot of pheno hunting is what we called it in the plant breeding world. Pop 1,000 seeds to kill 998 plants.
Exactly right. And y'all touched on something without putting too much emphasis on it, and that's evaluating your birds. You got to get those birds in your hand, because you don't know for sure what that body is like. You can't see the body. You can see the feather outline, but you can't see the body. So you have to acquire the skills and learn how to properly handle the bird to tell how long is the back, how deep is the body, how much distance is between the pelvic bones. That's something you only figure out by handling your bird.
Mandy, how many times have you been asked for the dimensions of your hand by viewers?
Oh, a couple of times. So I did do a video where I actually put my specific hand measurements on, because one of the pieces of advice I give to people, because they send me pictures of their flock going, what do you think of this male or this pullet? And I'm like, I can't tell you what I think of this bird from a picture. The most important part of it is what it feels like and what it handles like. And I can't see it in a video. I can get like a little touch of what is suggested, but until your hands are underneath those feathers, you can't make a judgment call. So I hesitate online, especially on social media. What do you think of this bird? I can't give them an answer because you've got to be hands-on. And I'm hoping when the Ohio Nationals is going on this November to have a couple of birds for people like Rip who want to see what I feel. Like this is what I'm feeling. Here, hold this bird. And I'll go home and eat those birds because I've taken them off property. But I'm going to bring birds that exhibit that kind of feel to see if that's something that had even been felt before. Because I've been through a lot of birds that didn't handle the same. And it's important for the dual purpose side of things, but overall condition too, because there's good condition and then there's table condition.
Mandy, one thing that I got to say I've honestly been really impressed about with the breast is that to look at the bodies, just the birds' bodies, they don't look like they would be that meaty of a bird.
They don't.
But then when you look at the photos of the carcasses of the birds, I go, I just can't believe all of that was hiding under those feathers, because they look like they would have very small breasts. The legs don't look all that meaty, but my goodness, when you look at a carcass of one of those, it's impressive.
They don't have a lot of fluff.
No,
I've handled Mandy's birds, and they're not fluffy. I'm wondering if the science experiment I've got going out in the garage are going to express fluffy or not, because they're being raised in a colder environment as compared to being raised in Ohio.
I was always under the impression that cold hardiness had fluff under the main hard feathers, but the hard feathers on the outside were actually tighter because they can hold more heat in.
Yes.
So in theory, they ought to still be tightly feathered, and whether they develop more fluff or not could be environmental, but that overall tightness shouldn't change much in theory.
And you're right, Mandy. If you look at some of those heavily feathered breeds like Orpingtons or Cochins or Brahmas or Langshans, the ratio of, if you pull a feather and look at the individual feather, the ratio of fluff on that feather to the ratio of firm web on that feather, sometimes there's a lot more fluff than there is web to the feather.
Mandy's sent me pictures of my Chanticleer feather side by side against her breast feather, and it's fuzzy halfway up the shaft on the Chanticleer, and the breasts are just tiny little bit right down the base.
Doesn't take that much fluff, just a little.
Yeah.
But you need a lot less insulation further south.
We're still north. I mean, we get a winter. I don't heat them, and I don't have draft-free. No, my birds live in a draft. They say the best thing for a coop is to be absolutely draft-free in the winter. And I'm using a 1,600 square foot barn built in 1908 that is, it has lungs. That building breathes. So they're essentially in an outdoor environment once it gets cold. Sometimes it's colder in the barn if there's extra humidity and I have to watch for frostbite, and I do need to be careful. There was last winter when we had a wind chill of 30 below, which is not common here. But all I did for them was put down a thick layer of straw in the pens and wrap the pens in plastic. And we had hardly any frostbite at all. Like the very tips of some very large summertime combs got a little tinged by it, but some people locally, their birds were losing more than 50% of their comb and wattles. It was brutal with
I
what
think
we
the
were seeing.
ability to evacuate that excess humidity kept the draft off of them, but got rid of all the humidity, which would have lent itself to additional frostbite. It scares me when I see people like turning their chicken coop into wrapping it tight like a sauna in the winter.
Yeah,
We know that's the worst possible thing.
It scares me when people use crock pots to heat up water and the males get to dip their wattles full on into that water that's been warmed up. And then they get surprised when 50% of those wattles froze off, because if they're able to dip into water in below freezing temperatures, that's a recipe for disaster.
It is.
Or when they smear Vaseline all over them, you turn that tub of Vaseline around, it has water as an ingredient. So they're adding the frostbite potential directly onto those combs. And they think they're doing the birds a favor, and they're not. They're setting them up for even worse frostbite than they would have had without the Vaseline. End rant.
Bam. Nice. I love it. I love these little tidbits. I never thought about that.
Well, I love to air some of that out, and the things that I wouldn't say in some instances on the internet where I have to bite my tongue and don't say it, but for the sake of education on a different platform, perhaps I can say it, and I just won't ever name any names between sorting out what's good advice and what's absolutely terrible and damaging advice.
So if somebody gets a frostbite, do you treat it in any way or just let it resolve naturally?
It depends on the severity. If it's too severe, I'll go ahead and dub. But I haven't had to deal with that since I figured out the husbandry methods to prevent it. So it's been over a decade. But that tissue, once it's damaged, it's not going to grow back. It's not going to come back. It'll eventually fall off on its own. But you can speed the healing process by taking care of a severe case and letting it heal from there. But if it's too awful bad, you could actually lose fertility in the male.
Oh, yeah.
And it might be over 2 months before he's fertile again. He might not be back to his normal self until May if he got severely nipped in February.
I've never practiced dubbing because I chose birds that have no comb and wattle because of our environment. And they're white birds. So that also helps.
How do you find them in the snow? Those big bright yellow feet?
No, they get lost in the snowdrifts. And in the winter, they're strange because they don't like to drink water. They prefer to eat snow.
Mine will do that. They'll go out and eat snow if their drinkers are frozen. They know what to do.
No, they've got water right next to the snow and they turn around and eat snow.
I've never experienced that down here in Florida, I got to say.
No.
Lucky.
Yeah, but you don't have to deal with the heat and humidity that we do either.
Right. And you need to have big combs and wattles to help dissipate heat and act as the natural radiator.
Goes right back to what we were talking about earlier. Location. And they're all different. Guaranteed.
It's really important. I'd like to find a resource that's somewhere in the desert Southwest that can occasionally offer some insight for those people, because I got nothing for them. Like, I don't know, keep them watered and fed.
Well, maybe just the road runners.
Yep. Oh, Mandy.
Well, hey, now Rip's already got me on this quest to breed a wild turkey to a domestic turkey next spring. So let's not talk about roadrunners.
Well, would that be for vigor, or would that be for, what's the reason there to do that?
Well, I was told that if we take a domestic turkey and allow it to be bred by a wild turkey, and we take that progeny, it's going to be some of the finest eating birds we've ever experienced. So I need to taste it for myself.
The proof is in the pudding, or the roasting, I guess I should say.
Interesting. I would have thought turkey tastes like turkey with differences of how they were fed out. And then maybe some texture differences between a double-breasted and a heritage type. And then the wild type would have that added flavor, but only because of the environment that it was raised in. That's the impression I've always had.
Well, different breeds will respond differently that's one of the things that I'm really excited about is raising some American breasts side by side with some Chanticleer on the same diet. And when we cut them open and cook them, to see if it's breed specific, if it's diet specific, where is this all beautiful flavor coming from?
You're going to be able to see it before me. I've got to wait probably till next spring, or I get to try that same side by side.
Well, somebody was supposed to be eating those birds that were left with them.
Well, yeah, but for science.
For science, yes. At least the small one.
It's part of the learning adventure. If you stick in the rule book and you always follow someone else's instructions, you're limiting your own potential for learning things for yourself that no one even could have told you unless they also went through the same scenario.
Yep, exactly right.
But I'm really excited to try this breast finishing diet on a Chanticleer and see if we get that same, fat development and intramuscular fat.
Look for it. If you spatchcock a couple of the birds and cut the spine out, you can see in between the ribs how strongly they took it, because what you'll get on either end of the bird and what you'll get along the muscle, like along the edges, it'll go there. But more importantly, you want it up in between those ribs, because when you cook them, that's what drips down through the rest of the bird. And I've seen it in Marans, and I've seen it. It's usually in French type varieties that have that genetic predisposition for that sort of fat development. But I'm wondering if the Canadian bird can do it too.
Y'all need to keep us posted on how this little scientific experiment you got going works out, because that could be interesting to know.
I'm getting hungry.
I'm excited to try it, and both of us are probably going to be chattering about it in the 360 Facebook group.
That's fine. The more the merrier.
Yeah. One other interesting question I had for you, Mandy, is now that you've been through this and started over a few times.
Several
times. Kind of, what would you do differently if you had to start over now, I guess? Well, I don't know if that's a fair question, because every time you started over, kind of what led you to that, I guess? And
I guess
what advice would you give to somebody else, I guess, is really what I'm trying to get at.
It's so subjective. Like, it's hard to give someone a clear answer, because the availability of stock is going to vary by region, time of year. If your timeline is to have a brand new batch of birds in the spring, in some cases, you needed to have your source lined up the summer before. If you decide in April that you want a batch of birds in April, it's going to limit your options a lot. So going into it with a plan in a long game and starting months or even a year in advance for your sourcing, because otherwise you have to look around at what's available and try to make your best guess, because it's going to be tricky to actually get to where you can go to someone's farm, handle their birds. That's not realistic in most cases. A lot of breeders, from biosecurity to just where they are, because sometimes you can get some good stuff shipped in, but you never got to see anything in person. And the main thing is finding your birds, but then going through and watching them grow and being patient and using your prior knowledge. If you don't have the prior knowledge, then research your little heart out, read books, get perspectives from people that are within that same variety or within that same classification of birds even, because some of them do share a lot of similarities. Because you can have mentors that don't have the breed you have, just for the core basics and the fundamentals. But aligning yourself with a mentor within the breed you want to work with, that's when you can get into the particulars of what's pertinent to that variety. And someone who's already gone through the gauntlet of breeding for better than a decade, they know a thing or two, and hopefully they can help you out.
They should be able to steer you towards some good stock, perhaps even.
That's the hope, but they're just not always available, and you got to start somewhere. Which is why I love that book you sent me, John.
can blame Rip for that. He turned me on to it, and I read it, and I was like, every paragraph is, represents decades of experience. It's so dense, the knowledge in that book.
Everyone's
Rip,
starting.
You want to tell us about this book, Rip?
Please.
It was written by, I met the gentleman, but probably one of the best modern day breeders of Plymouth Rock that I had the pleasure of knowing. But it's just so common sense. And the book is titled Start Where You Are with What You Have. And you can get it from the American Bantam Association. I think it's like, what, $10 or so? It's not an expensive book.
Yep. Shipping's $8. Get your membership and order your leg bands at the same time.
Absolutely. But it's just so full of information you really need to know. And it will answer a lot of questions that you really didn't realize that you had.
And the way it's written, it doesn't, confuse you with fancy words. It's just straight to the point. And for me, when I read it like that, I'm like, oh, of course. It's like every sentence is a blinding flash of the obvious.
Said in terms that are easy to understand, and it also emphasizes the importance without burying it in a lot of technical terms. And it has a good glossary too.
He gets to the point, and he doesn't belabor doing that or anything. It's just like, here's some things you're going to find. Here's some things you can expect. Here's some things you need to do. Here's some things you need to watch for. It's just good, practical poultry keeping information.
It probably took me 10 years to learn on my own what's in that book.
And I'm not going to tell you how long it took me because I got you beat. Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Folks, this has been a great show. And again, we want to welcome Mandy to being one of our co-hosts here on the Poultry Keepers podcast. You're going to bring a lot to the program, as I think folks have witnessed by what we talked about today. We've learned about you, but we've also learned a good bit about some things you need to think about with your own birds and some things that you can apply. So I'm looking forward to a very bright future for the Poultry Keepers podcast. We always want to add value to our listeners and give you the best possible information that we can come up with. So, before we leave, I also want to remind you, if you've got a question or comment, shoot us an email. Our email address is hot linked right in our show notes for each show. But we want to hear from you. If you want more information on a particular subject or you got an idea for a show, just shoot us an email. We'd love to hear from you. So by golly, until next time, be sure that you keep your birds scratching.
Oh, and pecking. No.
I wondered if that was my cue. Do I say it?
Actually, Mandy, I think you should be scratching and I should be pecking or something like that.
Well, I think we need to come up with a 3-part close. I don't know what that is, but we'll work on that.
If you say scratching, John says and with dramatic effect, and I go, king.
I don't know. Had them all out there stepping and fetching like their heads are on fire and their fluff was catching.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, gee. Folks, until next time, have fun with your birds. Keep them happy and healthy, and we'll talk to you in a week. So long. Bye-bye.
Next time, you guys.
Don't worry, we fix it in post-production.